the organizer of IRSEC 2020, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure for me to share these moments with you. So my talk today will be on will focus on IAQ and ventilation now at the COVID-19 time. You may ask, oops. So you may ask why addressing IAQ indoor air quality issue today. In fact, it's a little bit related with the talk given by Matt Santamoris, because IAQ is a worldwide health issue. Since the 1950 and the big episodes of smoke events in London, most of the country focused on the impact of ambient air on health, and most of this country developed agency in order to evaluate the outdoor air pollutions and try to reduce its impact on health. But as you may see on this figure, the WHO organization made a large review of health impact of air a few years ago, and what is shown on this figure is that the impact of indoor air on health is more important than the outdoor air or ambient air. It's obvious because we will spend more than 80% of our lifetime in enclosed environment, mainly in buildings or transport systems. The overall evaluation of this impact is about 8 million deaths in the world in 2012, as shown on this figure. And what you can see is mainly Southeast Asia and Africa are impacted by this role of indoor air on health and mortality. And mainly this is due to the traditional cooking using coal or wood in non-ventilated kitchen. If we look in details to the burden of disease due to indoor pollutants, as our colleagues from Finland did a few years ago, what we can see here is that more than 2/3 of this of the pollutant responsible for disease. This study was made with people entering the hospitals. Okay, so they address the diagnosis, address the disease to certain pollutants. And here, what you can see here, that more than 2/3 of these pollutants responsible for disease are the particles, small particles, what we call PM2.5 in this figure. Another element is that if you look at the second figure, you will see that in the probability of allergic symptoms, for instance, for children, the influence of the ventilation here, and as the ventilation increase, you can see here that on this figure that the number, the probability to have the allergic symptoms will decrease with an increase of the airflow rate. The airflow rate is maybe not the more convenient index for indoor air quality, but it's mainly the one we use in this case. Furthermore, this indoor air quality or indoor pollution, better said, is a real problem because of its economic and social cost. I present here, we made in France two studies, one in a European project, NV project, and the second one was during a study by the National Observatory for the Indoor Air Quality. It was during the year 2014. And what we did, in fact, we tried to evaluate the overall sanitary cost of few pollutants, in fact, indoors. So we just selected 6 of them. And the final result of this study is that the overall cost of the pollution due to these contaminants is about 30 billion euro by year in France, only for these 6 pollutants. And you may see here that the more important one more time, are the particles. It's the same for different kinds of diseases. For instance, for asthma, in France, we have about 4 million persons affected. And the total cost is more than 1.5 billion euro per year for the nation. So the impact of the indoor air quality on, let's say, the financial, the sanitary, budget for a country is something very, very important. But not only, it's also a very important issue, let's say, for private economy. I just represent here the share of the overall cost of a building. It's a tertiary building, it's an office building, during its whole lifetime. What you can see here, that the biggest cost of this for this building during its lifetime is, of course, the cost of the employees. It's more than 80% of the overall cost. The energy is less than 1% during the lifetime of the building. And the building cost, the construction cost, is also about 7%. And this is important to consider if you want to define efficient strategies, in fact, in this kind of configuration. Why? That's, Yes. Why? Many studies over the world, mainly, let's say, a big study realized in the States by Bill Fisk, and another one in Europe by Olli Seppänen a few years ago, and more recently by Paweł Warkowski from Denmark. They show that the indoor environment quality, or the indoor air quality and comfort, are the leading elements for the productivity at work or learning of the students, learning performance of students. You can see here, it's just an overview of one study, that if you increase, let's say, the indoor air quality in a room, you will increase also the productivity or the performance, let's say, of the person working in these buildings. And for instance, you can see here that if you change the ventilation rate from 10 to 15 liters per second per person, you will increase by 1% the productivity. But 1% of productivity for the overall cost of the workers in the building, which is 80% of the total cost of the building, is already more or equivalent to the energy cost of the building during its whole life. It's 25% of the cost of management and maintenance, and it can compensate 10% of the construction cost. So it's a real economic issue to improve, let's say, the indoor air quality in buildings, even for, let's say, a private company. Oops. It's very sensitive, yes. Another element to take into account is the pandemic we are living today. It's one of the reasons to address the IAQ issues. At the beginning of the pandemic, the World Health Organization, WHO, considered two main, let's say, routes of infections. The first one was the direct infection by big droplets emitted by a person and who can directly contaminate another person. And the second one is due to the fact that these big droplets, they will fall on any surface around the emitter. And so the second route of contamination is the fomite one, we call it, is indirect contamination due to the surfaces. If you touch the surfaces and then you put your hand to your nose or mouth, you can be contaminated. With time, we had many evidence that it was not sufficient to understand all the episodes of contamination we have been looking at. When we are coughing, sneezing, speaking or thinking, we will emit also very small particles. And these particles, they can contain, in fact, infectious virus, and they will be transported by the airflow pattern in the room. And this is what we call the airborne transmission. So I will just explain in detail. Oops. So, what kind of particles are we looking at? In the air, we have a big mix of different kind of particles coming from outside or inside the buildings. And these particles, we can classify them by their size, let's say, in the first attempt. Okay? And so you can see, for instance, the tobacco smoke from nanometers to roughly 1 micrometer, bacteria from 1 to 10, and pollen, and so on. And the smallest one are gas molecules. The viruses are between these particles, and they range from 10 nanometers to quite, let's say, 1 micrometer. The importance is the virus we are considering is when it's alone, its size is lower than 0.1 micrometer. It's around 0.8, 0.9. Okay. Oops. I had some problem with the. Okay. If we look to the influence of airborne particle on health, it's directly linked to their size because of their penetration level. So we can classify, and it's something which is shared, of course, we can classify the particles with their size and their penetration level. And we will talk about breathable, thoracic, or inhalable particles. So the viruses, which size is less than 1 micron, will go directly to the alveoli of the lung, and the health impact will be much more important. So now, what is the emission process? When you are speaking, thinking, or coughing, you will emit a wide range of size of particles. But most of them will be, let's say, between 1 and 50 microns. Okay? The biggest particles, they will fall very quickly, but the smallest one, they can stay in the air during hours or even days. If we look very quickly to the dynamics of particles in here, roughly speaking, it's directly linked also to their size. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated because they are sensitive to the instantaneous velocity field, of course. But roughly speaking, what we can say is for very small particles, let's say less than 10 micron or even around 1 micron, the drag force, which is given by the flow, the velocity pattern, if you want, will take the particles and they will stay in this flow during a long time. When the size increase, in fact, the gravity forces will increase also, and they will fall with time, and they will quit, if you want, the airflow patterns. And for bigger particles, even it's quicker, and they will fall directly. Of course, the prediction of the distribution of particles in the room is something quite difficult. So we developed years ago different kind of models for very, very small particles. Their behavior is close to the gas molecules from nanoparticles, for instance. So we can use Allard models with CFD and specific turbulent model. And for bigger particles, we are using Lagrangian model in order to follow them in the flow. Oops. This figure is just to show you what we are talking about. If we have a source of particles at 1.5 meters of height, you can see here that the smallest particles, the traveling distance will be much more important than the biggest one. Okay. Even so, it depends, of course, of the velocity field. So we put here two examples with the air velocity of 0.05 meters per second and 0.2 meters per second, which is considered still in the comfort zone for indoor environment. So you can see here that the smallest particles, they will stay during long distance in the airflow. I am sorry, but I have some problems for. There is no way to. I'm sorry about that. I cannot. No, it's not a problem. Let's say for the strategy to avoid the contamination with any kind of pollutant, it's like a pyramid, if you want. And the first step, the more important step, is to control the sources. Okay, and then you can add some technical systems or policies or personal protection like masks. But for airborne particles, of course, in order to reduce the source of infection, the most effective way is the ventilation, of course. Just this figure, it shows a recent study with one person, which is speaking in this case in a room, and on the left side you have the field of particles in the rooms with ventilation, and so you can see that the concentration is quite low, and the biggest particles are falling, and the smallest one, few of them are in the air, but they will be entrained by the ventilation flow. And the second figure on the right, it shows when the ventilation system is off, and then the concentration of small particles in the room is building up and can be very important. So, conclusion about the aerosol airborne transmission routes. There are new evidence and general recognition of this aerosol-based transmission. Today, it's an evidence that this route is totally recognized today. But of course, it's very dependent of the situation, and to know if one route is dominant on the others. For instance, in hospital, if you have a very big rate of ventilation, of course, the aerosol transmission is mostly eliminated by the ventilation. But in poorly ventilated space, it may be dominant. It has been the cases in many cases we know now. And so now, how can we evaluate in a first attempt, in an engineering way, let's say, the influence of ventilation on this airborne transmission risk, in fact? And there is a theory by which is well known, which is the West relay theory. Relay was working at the end of the 70s about, let's say, respiratory infection, and he developed this theory in order to evaluate the risk of infection due to airborne transmission. Okay, and this is mainly based on the definition of what he called quanta, and the quanta is let's say a particle, infectious particle emitted by one person on which is able to infect another one. Okay, so it's a probabilistic approach, but it's based at the beginning on a deterministic approach of the concentration of these particles. So you can evaluate the concentration in a room in function of the volume of this room, of the emission and the time, and of course the lambda is representing the, let's say, the first order loss rate coefficient for the quanta, and it's due to the sum of various phenomena which are modeled here very roughly. It's the ventilation, of course, the deposition onto surfaces, the virus decay by itself, and the filtration even by portable air cleaners if they exist. Of course, this is a rough approach of the problem. It's just to give an evaluation of the risk. It doesn't take into account the airflow patterns or even the difference in size of the particles and so on. Yes, the problem we have known during this infection period is that we knew the dynamics of the aerosol in the room, but we were not able to know if these particles will be maintained in the air during hours are still infectious or not. So there has been a strong work done by colleagues from microbiology, etc., in order to define how long these particles could be infectious too. And now we have data on this. We know that the, let's say, the half time life of a virus in the air is more than 1 hour. It's about 1.2 hours. And it means that it may remain active during 2 or 3 hours in a room. Then colleagues have been working on the definition of the quanta emission for different activities, taking into account specific cases described in the literature. So we have now data on this on this domain, which was not the case at the beginning of the infection. Oops. Oops. Excuse me, but excuse me, the presentation disappeared from my screen.
Yes, I think we can ask the moderators, because I do not have the, okay. It is again.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, Professor, you have about 2 minutes to conclude.
Yes, but I cannot manage with the screen now. Could you put the next slide?
You can control now.
I'm sorry, but it doesn't work.
Move on.
Oh, okay, that's good. And so we can use this theory in order to evaluate the impact of the ventilation rates. Okay, what you can see in this, and I will conclude very quickly, of course, is that the influence of ventilation is specific cases, for instance, an open plan office, a 2-person office or classroom. The probability of infection is directly linked to the size of the room, the number of occupants, of course, and also the time in this case. And the more important element is that you can see here that to decrease the probability of infection under, let's say, few percent, it's very difficult in most of the cases. It means that the overall airflow rates we are using in ventilation today are not sufficient in most of the case to ensure a safe rooms. Excuse me, but it doesn't work. I'm sorry for that, but could you put this? Yes. So the limitation of this probability calculation is that these results are very sensitive to quanta emission, so we have to be very careful. This makes absolute probability of infection uncertain. Okay, it's more coherent to speak about order of magnitude, and it's only applicable to a large population, and it's you cannot apply to 1%, for instance. And it assumes a lot of hypotheses, like a full mixing, which creates more uncertainty on because we are not taking into account the airflow patterns. Please, could you put the next one? I'm sorry, but so that's why we developed also evaluation of, let's say, relative risk evaluation. So the idea is very simple. We define a reference case. In this case, it's closed, very low ventilation rate in a room with 1 infected person. So with a very low ventilation rate, we have quite 100% of contamination. And so we look at the curve when we increase the ventilation rate in order to see how it will evaluate. And you can see here that I put here the reference to the main standards in defining the indoor environment conditions. It's the ISO standard and SEN standard. And you can see here that only with this standard, they are not providing sufficient protection because we have a high relative risk. Next, please. So the lesson learned for ventilation strategy from the COVID-19, excuse me, higher ventilation rates are mandatory in order to limit the infection risk as low as possible. Most of the regulation, they are old in the world, and they were based on, let's say, a more anthropogenic emission of CO2 and humidity, and they are not consistent with the health protection, let's say. Most of our ventilation standards do not fulfill the requirements. We need to increase air supply and exhaust ventilation, use open-up window if necessary. And we have to be careful also with the installations. Most of the installation we have today, they use recirculation, or they use each recovery system, which have to be controlled very specifically in this case. Next, please. There is a very huge social demand. This is an inquiry we made in France. So you can see that 90% of French people are making a direct link between the health and IAQ at home. So we need more effort in this domain. Please, next slide. And a new research agenda is necessary. So we need future research about the cross-contamination, air distribution, outdoor air ventilation capacity aspects as the first priority. The risk management has to be improved, and it can be also dedicated. We can use monitoring for that, and a practical solution to protect against the aerosol transmission of infectious disease in indoor environment should be developed. And we need more knowledge. This pandemic has brought many problems, so we need more knowledge about the distribution of these viruses in the buildings. And so the building code standards and guidelines should be revised because they were not focused on this kind of problem. Next slide, please. So my conclusion will be back to fundamentals. We never built a building to save energy. A building should be a shelter. It needs to be safe, healthy, and comfortable. For health, an effective and efficient ventilation is mandatory to ensure a satisfactory indoor air quality. And in this period, my opinion is we may use more energy to reach these targets. So we have to rethink a little bit all the building codes and regulation. They have been developed at the end of the 70s and because of the oil crisis, and they are more dedicated to energy than health and comfort. And of course, maybe we have to think differently now, and because this energy